Hey everyone, welcome back to the Testing Psychologist podcast. Welcome back to a clinical episode. We are continuing a loose theme, I suppose, over the past few weeks of talking about learning disorders. And specifically, we're talking about dyslexia today. I am so grateful to have a true giant in our field joining me for the conversation today. Dr. Nancy Mather is a professor emerita at the University of Arizona. She's published numerous articles and books and conducts workshops on assessment and instruction, both nationally and internationally. Her most recent book on dyslexia is Essentials of Dyslexia, Assessment and Intervention, second edition. She's a co-author of several widely used tests, including the Woodcock-Johnson 3, 4, and 5, maybe even the R. She's been involved with the WJ for a long time, and most recently, the Test of Dyslexia. So you have likely seen Nancy or heard her on any number of podcasts, conferences, webinars, presentations. She is pretty prolific in our field. And like I said, super grateful to have this conversation here today. So Nancy and I touch on a lot of facets of dyslexia and learning disorders. So we do some basics. We talk about sort of the historical understanding of dyslexia and what's involved and what's happening in our brains. We talk about, of course, methods of assessing dyslexia and what a good dyslexia assessment looks like these days. We talk about Nancy's journey and progress and the project of creating the tests of dyslexia in an effort to create a truly comprehensive dyslexia assessment measure. We also talk about intervention and state of the research these days with what's most helpful in treating and supporting individuals with dyslexia and plenty of other things. As usual, we veer off into a couple of topics that are off script and hopefully compelling for those of you out there. So if you have any interest in dyslexia, if you work with kids or even work with adults, there's a ton of information to take away from this episode. So please join me for this conversation with Dr. Nancy Mather. Nancy, hey, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Jeremy. It's nice to be here with you.
Yeah, likewise. I, a little bit starstruck. You probably hear that a lot, given everything that you've done in our field, but such an honor to be here chatting with you, and I'm excited about our conversation. So yeah, thanks again for being here.
Thank you.
So I'll start with a question that I always start with, which is, of all the things that you could do in this field, what kind of called you, to this area of learning disorders and dyslexia? Like, why spend your time in this particular area?
Well, kind of go back to how my career progressed. I got a master's in behavior disorders.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got a job at a middle school in a self-contained class. Back then it was called emotional disturbance for children with behavior disorders. And one of the things I realized quickly that one of the biggest problems of these students was they had trouble reading. And so they were angry. They felt they didn't belong in school. They were humiliated. And I thought, how can it be that we get kids to 7th and 8th grade and they can't read?
Mm-hmm.
And so it just kind of struck me about how important it is for children to get early intervention and learn to read, and also understand that they have dyslexia or what else is going on. So it's not a mystery. And so they can, learn to self-advocate, and, increase their confidence, et cetera. So it just kind of then got me motivated to think, how can we help these kids? And is with the master's in behavior disorders, I really knew nothing about teaching reading. And so then I felt like I really can't help these kids with the kind of help that they need. So that's motivated me to learn more about interventions and teaching kids with learning disabilities.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point. I mean, we work with a lot of kids here in the practice, and, it's always a concern, always a question of learning issues. If they're having behavior issues in school, it's like, well, how are they doing with the learning? Because that's such a big part of
Right.
it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I always think about too, if I had to do something for 8 hours a day that felt really hard and I didn't feel good at, I'd probably be acting out too, or, not having a good time. So it
Right,
just makes sense.
absolutely, and if nobody really understands you and understands why you're struggling, but and also understands you're probably pretty smart,
Sure.
in other ways, and so but if nobody really helped you understand that, you just think how difficult school would be.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. And it seems like everybody else gets it, like nobody's really talking about it. Yeah. It's a recipe for
Yeah.
disaster. Yeah.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah, absolutely. They're sitting watching, the student next to him. They're on the first page, and the person next to him's already on page 10. And then they're
Sure.
thinking, why is it so easy,
Hmm.
for that person and not for me? And yeah, so just kind of constantly bringing up your shortcomings in terms of learning
Hmm.
and your
Exactly.
difficulty.
Exactly. Yes. So you have stuck on this topic for, I think like basically your entire career. Is that right? I mean, you've
That's
really
true.
centered. Yeah. So maybe I would love to hear how, I'm trying to think how to formulate the question, but just like, how do you stay engaged? Like, what has kept you so interested and invested and, able to sort of zero in on the same area for so long?
Well, I think I've been fascinated, both in terms of creating assessments that can help identify um, what is it that's causing the problem for the student. What are the things and what are their needs in terms of accommodations, et cetera. So, really trying to find assessments that would help clarify why. Why is the student, having trouble? And then also trying to develop a deeper understanding of what are the interventions that are needed and how should they be delivered.
Hmm.
And so trying to really understand too, making the connection between the assessment and the intervention. And so it's not just one or the other, but making those connections between you do an evaluation. And then what's important are your recommendations and ideas for helping this student or resolving the problems or making school tolerable, but those recommendations are so important. And so just kind of being
Hmm.
fascinated by making the connections between assessment and intervention and trying to get students the help that they need.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. It's a deep well, I suppose, when you are looking at the full picture and I feel like
Mhm.
you're tapping into each of those areas that can keep you going for a long time. So I would love to talk about that. So you have a unique perspective, I think, again, like having done this for quite a while, right? And been involved from so many different, angles, right? Test development. I mean, for anyone who may not know, you've played a major role in the Woodcock-Johnson, several versions, and the Test of Dyslexia. You've, co-authored books. I mean, you have a pretty robust perspective. So could you maybe we start with, a little bit of background. Could you walk us through at least like from your understanding, your memory, like how have we understood dyslexia over time? And, how's that shifted? How's that changed over the years?
Well, truthfully, we've really known about, dyslexia from the 1800s on. Early on, it was called word blindness, and then there were
Mm,
cases of word deafness. And so the, terminology has changed across the years. And then there was sort of a period where people didn't want to say the word dyslexia. And so they'd say a specific learning disability in basic reading skills or reading fluency
mm-hmm,
or a reading disability. But even sometimes in schools, people were told, don't say that word,
mm-hmm,
don't tell the parents, don't use that word. And, I really think now we're on just sort of the complete opposite trend of it's important to say dyslexia and talk about dyslexia and help understand parents understand and children understand what it is and how you're going to help them. So you just sort of see an evolution in terms of terminology in the field. But really, we've been aware of for over a century that there are people who have a very hard time learning to read. And again, I think we could apply that to really anything that people learn. There's group of people who have trouble learning mathematics. There's a group of people who aren't good in sports. I mean, and so I think if you take, any people who have no musical talent, and
Hmm.
back then in the 1930s, that was classified as a disability, was difficulty in music, because music was so
Hmm.
important in school. And so,
Hmm.
if you couldn't keep up, it was classified as, a type of disability. But even back in the 1930s, they were talking about, and sometimes they were called special disabilities back then, but the children who would be so good in mathematics but struggle to learn to read, or then just the opposite pattern.
Hmm.
And so really there's a pretty rich history when it comes to thinking about learning differences and learning disabilities.
Yeah, yeah, certainly, certainly. How about I guess you'd say, like, the neurobiological component, as far as like the factors that might be contributing to dyslexia? Like, how have you noticed that kind of shift over time, if it has shifted, and then kind of bring us to the present in terms of what's actually happening in the brain with dyslexia?
Well, I'm not sure how much I can really speak on that. I mean,
Mm,
people again talk about the left hemisphere, the brain being much more involved in the right hemisphere. Parieto-temporal lobe places in terms of making the sound symbol connections, what's called the word form area, kind of back of the ear, trying to get visual images of words. I think there's just been more studies, again, showing that it is a neurological difference, that there's a difference. I mean, whether,
mhm.
you know, so there's just difference in terms of kind of what is happening in the brain. But, there's even been some research showing when a person gets a really good intervention, those parts of the brain start lighting up a little bit more, getting more active, and so maybe we really can change brains, a little bit. But
Sure. That's encouraging.
yeah,
We'll definitely talk
yeah.
about intervention. I want to pin that and, come back to it in a bit, because, we're always trying to figure out how to intervene and support individuals with dyslexia. Yeah. And even as far as, we don't have to get in the weeds, physiologically or structurally necessarily, but, things like dyslexia being a challenge with phonological awareness and processing speed or rapid naming, and like these different sort of skills or constructs, I suppose, that kind of contribute to reading. um, can you speak to that a little bit as far as like our current understanding of which skills are being enrolled there?
And I think one thing we see is a shift away from a single deficit model of dyslexia thinking is just attributed to poor phonological processing,
Hmm.
to a multiple deficit view of dyslexia, where there are multiple linguistic risk factors that can contribute to reading failure. But not one of them can rule in or rule out dyslexia. And so we have some students that have poor phonological processing that are good readers. And so just because there is something, there's not necessarily something. But we do know that the more weaknesses you have in these areas, like phonological processing, orthographic processing, working memory, processing speed, rapid naming, these linguistic risk factors, the harder remediation is. And lots of times the more severe the dyslexia, would be. So I really think now people are embracing a multiple deficit view, because for a time there, the real focus was just phonological processing. And if you didn't have a problem there, it's not dyslexia,
Hmm.
and it's not that simple. And, so there's, all those other things going on. And, we see like with rapid naming, processing speed, those kinds of time tasks, they affect reading fluency, not
Hmm.
reading accuracy. And so there's kind of a different impact depending where the weaknesses are and strengths are.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Certainly, certainly. Yeah. Yeah. To me, it feels fairly intuitive when we talk about phonological processing, or even processing speed. Orthographic processing also feels intuitive for the most part. I would love for you to explain rapid automatic naming and how that is implicated in reading and then subsequently dyslexia. Could we go there for a second?
Sure, sure. So, Dr. Martha Dankla was one of the people back in the 70s with Rita Rudell, who really kind of came up with this rapid automatized naming paradigm,
Hmm.
essentially. And, originally it was sort of a test they would give to people in the hospital to check their recovery from stroke, how fast.
Hmm.
And so they'd show them colors or letters or something Monday, and then they check them again Friday to see. And so they were seeing again how quickly, they were recovering. And then Dr. Denkla thought about, wonder if this would apply, to reading. So they developed RAND measures. And since that time, Marianne Wolf has done really a lot in the field too regarding RAND. But there's a very strong link between rapid automatized naming and reading fluency. And of course, anytime you have timed measures, they tend to be related. So when something's being timed, how fast you go, there's a relationship there. But lots of times, again, with our older kids, and also in languages that are more transparent or more regular, RAN is a stronger predictor than phonological awareness of dyslexia, because it's not hard to get the accuracy. So
Mm,
it's the speed that remains, an issue. And so
yeah.
in many other languages, RAN is a stronger predictor than phonological awareness.
Well, that's fascinating. What can you give me an example or two of languages that are more, what did you call it, regular and
Well, yeah,
predictable?
transparent.
Transparent. Yeah.
They're called shallow orthographies or transparent orthographies, but the connections between the sounds and the symbols aren't as complex. I mean,
Mm.
so languages like Finnish and German, even Spanish,
Hmm.
there's it's just more, here's the letter, here's the sound. And it's not
Hmm.
like English again, where we have so many speech sounds, phonemes and graphemes, letter patterns representing them, that English and French have deep orthographies, making it harder to learn to read in these languages because the orthography is more complex.
Hmm.
So, but RAN has been shown to be a better predictor in those transparent or shallow orthographies than phonological awareness.
Yeah, yeah, that does make sense to me. I'm gonna veer off just for a second because this is super interesting. But do you know much about rates of dyslexia in other countries? I mean, and how those compare? And is it language dependent, so to speak? I mean, does that influence rate of diagnosis?
I mean, I would say it is language dependent, and I'd say there's probably more cases in English and French, than say in Spanish. But, it's interesting because you'll see prevalence rates anywhere from 5 to 20%, depending who you're
Chief.
reading, right? Most researchers say 5 to 8% in terms of prevalence rate, not as
Hmm.
high. Now, 20% of our kids probably have trouble learning to read, but it's not necessarily dyslexia. Maybe English isn't their first language. Maybe they have ADHD. Maybe, there's lots of other reasons why they're perhaps struggling. So, say probably our best estimate is the 3 to 8%. and not as high as you'll hear people say 1 out of 5 children have dyslexia, and that's just not accurate. I don't think, but yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful. I didn't even, this is kind of silly. I didn't even really think about the language complexity having an influence on how we assess dyslexia, but that totally makes sense. I mean, phonological awareness gets a lot more complicated when you have more atypical or irregular words. Yeah,
Right,
I mean, it
right.
makes it harder, certainly.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, continuing down this path just a little bit, I would love to get some of the myths around dyslexia before we maybe transition to more assessment related questions. But yeah, I mean, you hear a lot about dyslexia, and I'm curious, yeah, if there are any like big myths that stand out to you that are worth dismissing here.
Well, I think maybe one common myth is that smart people can't have dyslexia,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just not true. We see twice exceptional students with dyslexia who are brilliant, but they're struggling with reading, right? And so I think sometimes people think, well, if you're smart, you can't have dyslexia. I think sometimes there's just like an oversimplistic statement, such as people with dyslexia see everything backwards. They see all their letters backwards, and so, people say things like that. And that's just overly simplistic. People with dyslexia do have trouble retaining visual images of letters and words, but they're actually not seeing things backwards, right? I mean, so
Mm-hmm.
I'd say, that's kind of another myth,
Mm-hmm.
and probably some myths regarding kind of comorbidity too. About 40% of people with dyslexia have another disability as well, and so ADHD or dyscalculia, or a developmental language disorder. And so, sort of a myth sometimes that oral language is going to be fine when you have a developmental language disorder and dyslexia. It's not going to be fine. So,
Mm-hmm.
thinking again, what can't be dyslexia because they're oral language. They're having, so I think that can cause some misunderstanding or too when people think, well, can't be dyslexia because they have a weakness in oral language.
Oh, sure, sure. Yeah, what about ideas like I think this has been pretty well debunked, but just, the idea that dyslexia is a visual disorder versus, a disorder of many other things and could be fixed with vision therapy, for example. I mean, we heard that a lot back, oh,
Right,
10, 15 years
right,
ago.
right, right. And so colored lenses and things. Yeah, right. The thing is, though, dyslexia is partially a visual disorder. And really, where it's captured is orthographic processing and your ability to retain a mental picture of a word. And like to acquire sight words and things. A person with dyslexia can see a word like, let's say, a second grade student, they can see the word it. They're in second grade and they're still sounding it out. And you're thinking, how long does it take for that to become automatized? And how many times have you seen that word and it's still not a sight word,
Yeah.
And so there definitely a visual aspect to dyslexia. And, with some of the cases, it's really a problem in orthographic processing, not phonological processing. In fact, they over rely on sounds rather than under rely. I mean, you'll see a high school student who's spelling they, Thay, instead SED, and they're in high school. And you think, how many times have you seen that word and you still don't know how to spell it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But they just listen to the sounds.
Mm-hmm.
And so they tend to over rely on phonology because, and if we go back historically, that was sort of what defined word blindness, that people, they seem like they're blind to printed words,
Mm-hmm.
and that was really kind of
Sure.
the first thing that was described.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that fits. That fits. What about the idea you hear a lot of things about sort of the positive aspects of dyslexia, like folks with dyslexia are like more creative, for example, or think outside the box and things like that. Is there any credence to those claims?
Um, just like any other people, some people with dyslexia are, some aren't. And so,
Sure.
it's not like, I mean, I think there's some truth to, maybe people with dyslexia, some of them perceive things differently or I just watched a YouTube video yesterday of a gal kind of just talking about this, how she was an excellent painter. And she had dyslexia and, but those were her skills and she could see colors and patterns and things but had trouble with reading. I mean, so there are some people with dyslexia who have special talents, but there's people without dyslexia who have special talents, so yeah, but it is always nice to identify the strengths of the student, uh, a person who has dyslexia, just because, that helps them in terms of thinking about vocational opportunities, career guidance, etc. What are you good at, And it may be something mechanical, or spatial.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, everybody does have strengths and talents,
Hmm.
but yeah, dyslexic folks aren't necessarily more likely to be creative than others.
Right.
Yeah, I
Right.
hear you. I hear you. Okay. And again, just a little bit more background before we transition to the assessment process. But how are we understanding the relationship between dyslexia and other learning disorders at this point in terms of like overlap with, math disorders or writing disorders primarily?
Hmm. So the three most common learning disorders are, dyslexia, dyscalculia, which is our math, and dysgraphia, which is our writing. There is some overlap in terms of the linguistic risk factors. For example, working memory can affect dyscalculia and dyslexia, right?
Hmm.
And so there's overlap in terms of linguistic risk factors. Now, under IDEA, they've also got oral languages type of learning disability. I really don't feel like it belongs there,
Mm.
just because it really fits better under oral language, sort of speech language area. It's a language disorder. And so I really like to think learning disabilities is being academic. If it's a problem in oral language, the person we want them to see is a speech language therapist, right? And so it makes some sort of confusing overlap between the fields a little bit, and just in terms of schools, like who's going to see the child and both, or I don't know. I just think it's clear, but
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, I know you've talked about some questions or concerns maybe around the IDEA classifications. Is that what you are referring to with that? Or do you have other thoughts around IDEA and how we might do things differently?
well, no, I just think the main thing is having, oral language as a learning disability causes confusion. That's all.
Yeah.
Clearly, there's kids with, developmental language disorders, but that's a clear category than a learning disability. It's a language disorder, but, and I think it just causes this unnecessary overlap and confusion, in schools in terms of, well, is that the special ed teacher or the speech language therapist or both of them, or, you know, who, who tests this student? Who helps this student? It, you know,
Sure. Yeah,
yeah,
it's a great question. It's a great question. Just for folks who might be wondering, there is some overlap, right? There's clearly overlap between language and reading.
sure,
So
absolutely.
yeah, how do you think of that separately in your mind? Like, how do we distinguish those two enough that, it would lead to kind of like a different classification or intervention between one or the other?
Well, I mean, lots of times you compare tests that have similar kinds of content, but one is administered orally and one, you read, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
comparing listening comprehension test to a reading comprehension test.
Hmm.
Well,
Hmm.
if you just have dyslexia, you're going to do better on the listening comprehension test,
Hmm.
right?
Sure.
If you have a developmental language disorder and dyslexia, they're both going to be low, right? So lots of tests have those nice direct comparisons between, an oral vocabulary test and a reading vocabulary test. And so you can kind of see those differences in terms of, there's not a problem in oral language. The problem's with reading and spelling, right?
Yeah, yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I can't leave this area without talking about diagnosis, I think, of dyslexia. So we have gone through a few different approaches to that. There's the discrepancy model, there's RTI, there's patterns of strengths and weaknesses, maybe others that I'm not thinking of. How are you thinking about diagnosis at this point in terms of how we actually identify learning disorders or dyslexia specifically?
You know, I mean, if you look historically or you think about learning disabilities, a pattern of strengths and weaknesses approach is the best way to identify learning disabilities because that's really what you're seeing. They're really good at some things and they're really struggling with other things. And that pattern is what suggests to you that it's a learning disabilities. Some of our kids with dyslexia do have an ability achievement discrepancy, particularly when they've had good oral language. And, so there's a discrepancy there sometimes, but, really a PSW approach is the most relevant in terms of learning disability, identification, looking at that pattern and thinking, well, does this profile sort of make sense in terms of child who's got incredible math skills and really struggling with reading. So
Hmm.
that's the best fit just in terms of diagnosis. But as you know, diagnosis is more complex than just tests. You also have to have information. A big one with dyslexia is family history. Family history is a big risk factor for dyslexia. So you always want to know, did someone in the family have trouble learning to read? And invariably they say, yeah, my dad or me or, my brother or, he still hates, to read. So family history is a key risk indicator. Also seeing what the parents say, what the teachers say, what the person says themselves. And so gathering a lot of qualitative information too, really helps with decision making rather than just test scores, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. All those factors are going to be super important and history and everything. Yeah. So can I throw two scenarios at you and see what you think from a diagnostic perspective. These are scenarios that come up a lot. So one of them is, the kiddo who has really high intelligence, let's say. So maybe they're, whatever full scale IQ is 118, 123, something like that. And then their reading scores, let's just say they have consistently lower reading scores, but they're like 101, 102, they're in the average range. So that's scenario one. Like in that case, are you thinking, hey, this is a kid with dyslexia. They're just really bright because that's a relative weakness. Or are you thinking, well, no, reading's average. So I think we're good here. Like, how would you think about a case like that?
Well, okay. So the thing is, what would happen in the school probably, people would say reading's average, so there's no big deal here. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter. But,
Yeah.
one of the things you really have to think about is what kind of intervention has the student had?
Hmm.
Um, I saw a fifth grade girl. Her reading scores are average now, but she's had 3 years of daily one-to-one instruction for an hour, 5 days a week with the Wilson reading system.
Oh,
Her
gosh.
readings, you know, I mean, it's phenomenal. It just shows you what intervention can do. Does she have
Uh-huh.
dyslexia? Of course she does, but she got great help, and so just an average reading score can't rule out dyslexia. What kind of help have they gotten? Well, none. I mean, or a ton, and they go to summer school. They have a tutor that comes after school every night, and so you just really have to sort of dig deeper into what kind of help have they had in the past? Because good intervention will lead to average reading scores. It's just a
Absolutely.
lot of hard work. It's a lot of hard work to get there, but they can.
Sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. I like the way you frame that. Okay, okay. So
Okay.
that's scenario one. This comes up a lot. Scenario two, which also comes up a lot, is a kiddo almost on the other end of the spectrum where, maybe their IQ is falling more around, let's call it like 79 or 82, and reading scores are similar, let's say, like 77, 78, somewhere around there, 80. Um, how do you think about those kiddos? Like, is that also dyslexia because it's like a relative, weakness relative to their peers, or commensurate with intelligence, and so not so much?
Well, I mean, usually in that case, it's more a slow learner kind of, category
Mm,
of, those
mm-hmm,
things are kind of matching, but again, you'd want to know, is there a language disorder too?
mm-hmm.
You'd have to know a little bit more in terms of the reasons for the lower scores or if there are reasons. So you need a little bit more background, but
Mm-hmm.
and that's kind of been historically one of the problems too is, we've got these kids that are just kind of low. They're low on IQ scores, they're low and reading scores just low, right?
Yeah,
But is it a disability? Probably not. We've got some kids that are just high. They're high. They're not super high, but they're high on everything, right? Are they gifted? No, probably not. But I mean, it's just like, but sometimes schools don't do a good job of accommodating those kids, because they don't learn as quickly as other kids do,
yeah,
and you'd have to ask questions too, like, is English their first language?
sure.
Do their parents speak English to them at home? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you sort of have to tease out, other kinds of things. And one thing we do see over time is with people with dyslexia, lots of times intelligence test scores decline as they go through school because they don't spend time reading. And uh, third grade on, the main way we acquire knowledge and vocabulary is reading. And so if you don't spend any time reading, your vocabulary doesn't grow at the pace of somebody who's an avid reader. And so it's not that
Such
you're
a great
less
point.
smart, it's just that you don't spend time reading and you're not exposed to the thousands of words you see as a reader.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm glad that you highlighted that. Yeah, I feel like that's easy to forget, but those years stack up. Years without reading make a
Yeah.
difference. I know. I know. So, okay, I've been teasing this forever. Let's actually pivot to the assessment process. I think people are super interested in that. So, maybe just like on a broad level, what would you say makes up a good quote unquote dyslexia assessment?
Well, I mean, that was part of the reason we created the test of dyslexia was, it was probably about 12 years ago. I was doing an evaluation for dyslexia and I was like, why do I have to go to 4 different tests to do this? I mean,
Yeah,
why?
relatable. Yeah.
Why isn't it in one place? And so we really tried to put everything in that test you would need to do a good dyslexia evaluation. So there's 23 tests in there. And then we also co-normed it with rating scales. So you get parent, teacher, self. So you get that qualitative information as well too. But, you know, and again, we sort of thought about what needs to be in a dyslexia assessment. Clearly, reading accuracy, decoding, reading speed, reading rate. You want to look at their spelling and so with dyslexia, Typically, it's a problem in word reading accuracy, rate, and spelling, okay, that then impacts written expression and reading comprehension.
Yes.
But those are secondary consequences of the problem, with the decoding and encoding skills, so, and then linguistic risk factors. So, we talked about processing speed and RAN and working memory and phonological processing. So, wanting to look at different, linguistic risk factors. We thought it was also important to have measures of vocabulary and reasoning, just to kind of rule out, or get some insight into level of intelligence. Is oral language a contributing factor? Is there a discrepancy between oral vocabulary, and reading? And so sometimes, again, adding in those, kinds of more cognitive kinds of measures is important. I think there would be times too you want to see how's their math,
Mm-hmm.
and so, again, is this bigger than reading, just just reading, but, I mean, so, it just kind of depends a little bit on the age of the student, where they're having trouble, so it's interesting. I saw a third grade boy, and he's been homeschooled since COVID 2020. So he's been homeschooled all this time. So he clearly has dyslexia, and he's reading like at a primer level. But what was kind of interesting, he doesn't know how low his reading skills are because he's not in school. So
Sure.
he's not seeing how easily other kids read, how fast they read, the big books they're reading. He's not seeing any of that. So he perceives, one of the rating scale question was that he answered, and answered, "I'm good at reading words," you know? And I thought that's sort of fascinating in a way that just because he's not being exposed, to peers, who are reading well. He
Yeah.
doesn't
There's no
understand how far
comparison. Yeah.
behind he is. I mean, he's
Mm-hmm.
so far behind, but he just doesn't have a clue, so I thought that's pretty interesting. But there's a strong family history, of dyslexia, both his brother and his dad, and it's kind of a no-brainer, but it was kind of interesting. I thought, not being in school is where you really, you know, see far beyond. You listen to other kids read and you're like, whoa, whoa, Yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah. We struggle with homeschool kids pretty frequently. Yeah. In
yeah,
terms of, well, it just, I mean, it throws a wrench in the assessment process.
yeah,
It's just hard to know, like,
yeah,
what kind of curriculum are they using? What's the consistency of instruction?
exactly.
How are they measuring along the way? I mean, it's really tough.
No, I know. It does add a whole level of, yeah, what's being done and how often is it being done. And yeah, it adds in a level of complexity, just as English is not your first language, adds a level, of complexity, as well when, dealing with a couple languages or so.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, so y'all developed this, the test of dyslexia, and that came out when? It was a couple of years ago, 2024, something like that.
Uh huh. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. I love just as a general approach, like solving your own problem. Like, why am I going to 4 different tests? And you're like, I'll just make the test. Like,
Exactly. I know. Yeah, it was kind of funny because it was just like, why am I, a little bit from here, a little bit from here, a little bit from here, and they all have different norms, and they describe their scores differently, and it's like, oh,
Mm.
anyway. So,
Yeah, yeah. So, gosh, I have a couple questions related to that. One, though, just an observation. I think it's really cool that it's co-normed with rating scales. That feels different
hmm
than any other measure that I know of, to capture,
hmm
kind of the subjective experience with the test results. That's really cool. Where do you see the test of dyslexia kind of slotting in to an eval? Like, is this replacing? If you can comment on this, like, does this replace subtests on like a bigger academic battery like the Wyatt or the WJ, or is it an adjunct? Like how do you think of, its role in battery?
Well, really our intent was to make it everything you need, truthfully. That was our intent,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But again, and as we know in evaluations, sometimes there's other questions, you want to look into written language more, you want to look into math more, so of course you need, other tests to do that. But, so a lot depends on what the referral question is. But if a referral question is, does my child have dyslexia? The parent wants to know.
Mm-hmm.
You know you're probably good with that, with the rating scale information, with the family history, with being able to answer that question. But if it's a general referral question, my child is struggling, with reading, writing, and math, and having a terrible time in school, you need a much broader, you need Woodcock-Johnson and other, measures as well. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yes, yes. Gosh, I am debating whether to ask about the Woodcock Johnson. There's so much there. I don't know if I want to go into that territory. We can stick with dyslexia specifically.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, okay. Maybe just like one or two questions around that. So, I mean, you
Yeah.
were involved in the WJ5, right? Like you're,
Right. I was,
yeah,
yes, and the WJ, well, actually WJR 345. So,
yeah.
back in the 80s, I did my dissertation on the WSCAR and the WJ, and I had 50 gifted kids and 50 kids with learning disabilities, and so had a lot of problems with the data, and that's how I got to know Dr. Woodcock. So,
Oh, yeah.
I'll just tell you quickly because it was kind of interesting. So, the original WJ, they had these suppressor variables in the oral language and the reasoning, trying to take oral language out of reasoning and trying to take reasoning out of analogies in oral language. And so with my gifted kids, it over subtracted. And with my LD kids, it over. And so it ended up with my study, my gifted kids were low in reasoning and my LD kids were high in reasoning. And I'm like, oh no, how do I
Wait a second.
how do I explain this?
Uh-huh.
Anyway, so that's it because I had the extremes. And so anyway, it was like, I have no way of explaining this. And that's when I got to know Dr. Woodcock, and they ended up taking out the suppressor variables after that because they realized it overcorrected on the extremes, so anyway, so then I started working for him and wrote the manual for the WJR. Yeah, so I've been involved forever.
Sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just a testament to how difficult test development is. I feel like and I don't even know, I don't even know, but just seeing from the outside, there are just so many layers and nuances. I have a lot of respect for
Yeah.
y'all who are really in the trenches with developing these measures. But yeah, I mean, I've had a long relationship with the WJ. I started grad school in 2002, and I think that was we used the WJ3, and then I think there was a normative update somewhere around there.
Yeah, there was. Yeah, there was.
And so kind of switched to that. But I guess, yeah, I'll keep the questions limited with that because I want to talk about intervention for dyslexia as well. But I feel like, the WJ5 was a big leap as far as the digital administration and development. And I don't know, I'm just interested in your like perspective and experience with that. Like, what do you think about this move to digital test administration? Let's start there.
Yeah, yeah. So WJ5 now, as you know, is computer to iPad. And you really need to use an iPad, not another. It needs to be an iPad because it was normed with an iPad.
Hmm.
It takes a lot of burden out of the testing essentially because you don't have to worry about basal and ceiling rules. I mean, it does everything for you, so there's some really nice features about that. A little bit more engaging, I think, probably for kids particularly. But, I'm a little bit old fashioned in that I just like to take notes on the test record and I like to turn
Mm.
easel page. I don't know. It's a
Yeah.
little bit of a tough transition for me because I just feel like I get so much from, being able to just write my notes down and watch them and, that, but there's just, a lot of nice features, quickly scoring it. One of the really nice features is you can make a template and just choose exactly which clusters or which tests you want, and it'll build that for you, and that's all that comes up. And so maybe you just want to give 5 tests, or maybe you want to do all 8 IDA areas, and so you've got the 2 tests of each, and you've got that template, so
Mhm.
you can build these templates to actually fit exactly what you need. Or maybe there's another test that you use that does this, this, and this, and so you can just choose exactly which tests or clusters you want and make that a template. There
Mhm.
is a dyslexia test set in there that is it contains achievement tests and tests from the virtual test library. So the test from the oral language battery got moved into achievement, so there's no oral language battery anymore.
Okay.
But and then you could add in some cognitive tests, but sort of really geared so it could be given by diagnosticians, reading specialists, and things. So it kind of had the WJ test most related to dyslexia.
Sure, sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I like taking notes on paper, and
Yeah,
I do
yeah,
miss that. We do a lot of iPad administration. I do miss that. I feel
yeah.
like that hasn't translated super well. Um, but on the other
Yeah,
hand,
it's
I mean,
hard to take the notes, I mean, when you
it
got
is
the computer and it's like, yeah, and then you want to remember, that gets harder too.
for sure, for sure. Yeah, right, right. Yeah, yeah. On the other hand, though, I am a big fan of anything that lightens the sort of cognitive load that we're
Yeah.
dealing with during testing. And lets us focus on the kid or thinking more deeply about the data or whatever it may be, instead of tracking basals and ceilings and whatnot. But I
Well,
don't know, it's a
and
it's a double-edged sword.
and the physical load of lugging around the whole Woodcock-Johnson,
Well,
yeah,
oh my gosh, oh my
yeah, yeah,
gosh,
yeah. So
yes,
it's just
yeah,
nice to have a little computer, little iPad, you get a little briefcase and that's all you need.
uh-huh,
So
hundred
that's a big
percent.
change. Yeah.
I know. I'm with it. I worked for a neuropsychologist in grad school for a few years, and there are a few of us in our grad program who were doing that practicum experience, and yeah, we would have to carry these. I mean, it was like 3 of those big suitcase cases, and
I
drop them
know.
off and wheel them around at other people. It was a lot.
Yeah, yeah,
It was
it's
a
great.
lot.
It was crazy, crazy.
Yes, yes. Let me see one more. I can ask one more question about the WJ, and then maybe we start to close with intervention
Okay.
for dyslexia. But you tell me, was the WJ5 the first one to sort of map on or reflect like the more contemporary CHC theory, or did that happen in previous versions as well?
No, it really started happening, I mean, a little bit with WJ3, but WJ4 for sure
Okay.
was totally based on CHC.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
That's fair. That's fair. So you're just carrying those changes, I guess, or updates, forward to the WJ5, which is great.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe we pivot back over to intervention for dyslexia here. So, gosh, maybe again, we start broad and then we can get a little more detailed depending on, the specific types or versions, weaknesses and whatnot. But at least at this point in time, what are we finding, broadly that's successful, for intervening and supporting dyslexia for kiddos?
Well, I mean, one of the main things that's important is early intervention.
Yeah.
And so catching these kids early, and you don't have to say they have dyslexia, but you have to say they need reading instruction. And so, getting them kindergarten, first grade, before they even realize that, they're going to have difficulty or whatever. So early
Hmm.
intervention is critical. We go back into the 1920s and Samuel Orton, and he knew how important it was teaching phonics to kids with dyslexia. They don't learn to read easily, so they really have to be taught about language structure. And the good thing is that there's a lot of good interventions, out there, and there's a lot of highly trained reading teachers out there, but
Hmm.
unfortunately, some schools still don't have anyone who's a specialist in dyslexia or, in reading therapy.
Right.
Yeah, so
It is challenging. That's a big challenge we run into is access. There are few private practitioners, tutors or reading specialists or whomever who can implement these interventions, but it's hard at schools sometimes and hard to know if they're being implemented to fidelity, even if they are research supported interventions.
well, exactly, and that fidelity is a big thing. When the program says it's supposed to be done 45 minutes, 5 days a week, that's what needs to happen. And so getting that fidelity is a big challenge. And, it also depends too on where are they developmentally in reading. Maybe
Hmm.
they just need to work on their reading rate and fluency, that their accuracy is good, they had good instruction, they're pretty accurate, they're just slow. And so that's a whole different set of interventions than the child who's not accurate. But again, with kids with dyslexia, we just start at the very beginning, couple consonants, short vowel sound, and teach them how to blend, how to segment, how to read the words, how to spell the words, and you just, keep building. And again, we've got a lot of good programs out there and a lot of highly trained teachers now, but the important thing is getting one. I hate to say it, but sometimes I've had to say to parents, because I know the school, you're not going to get the help you need in that school.
Hmm.
You either have to hire a tutor or change schools, or because there's nobody in that school that knows how to teach reading to kids
Yeah.
with dyslexia. So, and it's ideally every school in our country would have a highly trained reading specialist. But then again, too, we've got to make sure they have enough time. You can't put 40 kids on their caseload, and
For
so,
sure.
yeah, it's just, making sure there's enough time.
Yes. Yes. It's a real push pull with that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one thing that you mentioned is, or alluded to, is a sort of different intervention for different weaknesses, which, intuitively makes sense. Walk us through, I mean, how could we kind of look at test results and take, scores from different areas and kind of map that onto personal intervention? How do you think about that? And like types of intervention that would be most appropriate, given the you know, different weaknesses that we might see.
Well, again, you've got to identify the areas of weakness, right? And so
Hmm.
that, let's say, phonological awareness is a real weakness and they're having trouble learning phonics. And
Hmm.
so you see they don't know how to blend and segment speech sounds. And so you would recommend to teach them to blend and segment using letter tiles or letters as the foundation, for learning phonics.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
maybe their phonological awareness is great, but they're having terrible difficulties spelling words. And so just strategies then, teaching them about spelling patterns and, common spelling units in our language, like shun, Tion, and teaching them, you know, this is how you spell this, even though it doesn't look like it or sound like it. But so it really kind of depends where you find the weaknesses. Maybe they're pretty good reading short words, but they don't know how to break apart a multisyllabic word into chunks to pronounce it.
Hmm.
And so maybe they need something more focuses more on morphology than phonology, right? So, really depends on the needs of the student, and not even so much the age, because you know we have some high school kids who are reading at a second grade level, so,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah. Do we ever get to the point where the window of intervention closes and you just move to accommodation? Or is intervention going to be helpful no matter the age?
Well, I would say intervention's helpful no matter the age, but, sometimes there may be certain cases where you just have to, you know, think we've got to get the accommodation set up because,
Hmm. Hmm.
you know, and it depends a little bit too on the goals of the student. Are they planning to go to college
Mm.
or are they going to do something else? How much are they going to need reading in their chosen field? So how important is reading going to be? And so you got to sort of look at where are they going, and but ideally, you know, I was thinking about this. It's been years ago, but a 35-year-old man, I evaluated his son, and then he said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "I can't read." And so back then I thought, well, we studied, I'd tutor him for 4 months. So we're in our first lesson and I'm showing him a couple letters, sounds. And he says to me, "You mean these letters make sounds?" I mean, he was 35 years
Goodness.
old, and I was just like, I was like, wow, wow. I mean, that he went all the way through school and didn't have that insight about the alphabetic principle that letters make sounds. And he said, "I could have learned to read." I said, "That's right, you could have, and you're going to." And, I think by the time we were done, he was reading at a third, fourth grade level, which was fine for what he was doing. But
Yeah.
it's just surprising sometimes the limited, understanding about speech and print somebody may have.
Certainly, certainly. Gosh,
Yeah.
that's a wild story. I know there are a lot of folks out there. Yeah. Steering back quickly to the intervention question, at least as far as phonological awareness, are we still thinking, sort of Orton Gillingham approaches are best? Are there other approaches that kind of burst on the scene that we should be considering? Where are we at with that?
Well, most of our current methodologies are really Orton Gillingham based. I mean, that was sort of the structure, and so most of them, have that kind of sequence. But there are specific methods designed for building fluency, and that's a whole different set of methods. And so
Hmm.
it depends again, is accuracy the issue? Is, speed the issue? Or, and so it really depends, again, a little bit how old they are, what are they struggling with. I think one thing that's pretty exciting now, there are quite a few computer-based interventions. It can work 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week with the computer program, and there can be highly effective. And so I think we're going to see, and even there's AI tutors now.
Hmm.
So I think we're going to see a lot kind of opening up more with technology because, we come back to the issue of time where teachers they might know what to do, but they don't have enough time or,
Right.
it's just like, so I think a lot of exciting things are happening with, technology too.
Certainly, certainly. Do you know, put you on the spot, and if not, that's okay, but do you know off the top of your head any of the computer intervention programs that are looking pretty good at this point?
Well, I mean, younger kids, K to 2, I'd look at read, write, and type by Talking Fingers.
Uh-huh.
And it teaches keyboarding, and letters and sounds, and it's engaging. It's kind of a game. Victor the virus sucks away the letters from the computer, and you've got to get them back. And so,
Okay.
it's pretty engaging and fun. So that's like, a good one, and kids show really good progress, and they like it. Mind Play is another one to look at. www.mindplay.com. 30 minutes, 5 days a week. It can be really good. There's programs like Great Leaps Reading where you can it's delivered through the computer online, but it's a real person giving the instruction. And it's like 15 minutes 5 days a week, and it's not, terribly not very expensive. And so it's an actual person. And so there's
Okay.
just, sort of a lot of exciting things in terms of getting more support than a live teacher, so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is great. This is great. Thank you. Thank you. So, maybe closing question. I'm curious what you foresee in the future of dyslexia, research, assessment, intervention. What are you excited about? Anything on the horizon to be looking out for?
Well, I think one of our biggest needs is getting more highly trained teachers, you know? And I actually just 2 days ago did a webinar for Wilson Reading System for their trainers who will be supervising people who are getting training in the Wilson Reading System.
Mm-hmm.
And they had 130 trainers that, well, I was like, wow, this is awesome. This is awesome. And so I'm pretty excited that there's momentum about people taking the time, wanting to get training, and it's happening. So that's probably, the most exciting thing I would think is I think we're really moving forward in terms of getting more highly trained teachers. And that's been one of the biggest problems is getting kids services early that are intensive,
Absolutely.
so.
Yeah, it's always the bottleneck. Yes. Great.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is there's much more increased awareness about dyslexia, and people aren't afraid to say the word anymore, or write it in
Mm-hmm.
IEPs, or to make a diagnosis of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's exciting because it really helps if you have dyslexia to understand what it is, how we're going to help you, and just being really honest with the person. It's going to be harder for you to learn to read, but you're going to do it. It's going to take you more effort, but you're so good at, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's exciting that there's more awareness about dyslexia, more attention to dyslexia, more understanding of dyslexia, more sympathy and empathy for people who have dyslexia, understanding it's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's like you have something that makes it hard to learn to read, but you also have these other great talents, So I remember this one boy, Andy, I tested. He was like in second grade, and I was explaining to him dyslexia and whatever. And he goes, I said, "You're so good." He says, "Oh, you mean it's just reading?" I said, "Yeah, it's just reading. It's just reading. It's not. You're so good at all these other things. Okay, it's just reading. I can handle that. So
That's great perspective.
yeah, yeah,
Gosh, yeah.
yeah,
Give me some of that, Andy. That's
yeah,
you've got
yeah.
a wisdom beyond your years. That's really good.
Mhm.
Nice, nice. Well, that's a good note to close on, I think. Yeah. Thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing all this. You are so influential in our field. And like I said, I'm just so grateful to get some of your time to chat through a topic that's super important for a lot of kids and parents and educators and practitioners. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun to talk to you, and next time we'll have a cup of coffee, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
Yeah, great.
All
Okay.
right.
Thank you,
Bye bye.
Jamie.